Hey everyone, Jared and Whitney here from Travel Therapy Mentor. Welcome to week 3 of our Travel Therapy 101 mini-series. Today we're going to be talking about travel therapy housing.
This is a 6-week mini-series that we're doing on the basics of travel therapy. On our first week, we went over what is travel therapy, and last week we did what is travel therapy pay and how does the pay work. This week we're going to be talking about housing, and then over the next 3 weeks we'll talk about licensing, recruiters, and tax homes. So make sure to tune in every week. We'll be doing a video and a podcast. The podcast will be the audio version of the videos every week. And then each week we'll also publish an article about the same topic for those of you guys that prefer to read. So let's get started today talking about finding housing as a travel therapist.
Yep, so the most common question we get, and usually the first question everyone asks when they're researching travel therapy, is does the travel therapy company set up housing for you? And the answer here is they can, or they can give you a housing stipend for you to find your own housing. The majority of travelers find their own housing, and the reason for that is there are some pros and cons to having the company find housing for you. The pros include less hassle and less worry if your contract is canceled. The cons include less control over the accommodation that you get. Obviously, if the company is finding housing for you, you don't have as much control over where you're staying. And then also that you make less money if the company finds housing for you. And that's probably the majority, I would say probably 90 to 95% of travelers find their own housing, with the reason most likely cited being that you get to keep more money there. Whitney is going to explain that a little bit more. Usually when the company finds housing for you, they'll put you either like in a corporate housing situation or like an extended stay hotel. And that may or may not be a good thing depending on your situation and your wants and needs. There are situations where it can make sense for the company to find housing for you, and that usually that's more in remote places where housing might be hard to find. And in a situation like that, the company might already have connections in the area with like extended stay hotels or something along those lines, where they can easily get you placed in there, and then you don't have all the hassle of trying to find it yourself.
Yeah, we've especially heard of that in some remote places like Hawaii, Alaska, like Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod. There's some places like that they will tend to offer housing for you because they know it's hard to set up, and they tend to have a lot of travelers come through. So sometimes the hospitals will even have like a apartment complex or a dorm situation that they use for travel therapists, for travel nurses, sometimes for students or residents that come there. So there are certain situations where having the company find housing for you would be better, but under most circumstances, we usually recommend taking the housing stipend. So when you get the housing stipend, it basically just becomes part of your pay package. So they'll say, okay, we're going to pay you this hourly rate, like we talked about last week in our pay video. We'll give you this hourly rate. We'll also give you the housing stipend and then the stipend for meals and incidentals. Well, most of the time, the housing stipend is going to be significantly more money than you actually need to spend on housing. They might give you something like $600 a week for housing, and then say you're able to find an apartment that's only $600 a month. Well, then you're pocketing so much more of that extra money that you're not spending on your housing.
Yeah, that's really the key there, and that's why so many travelers find their own housing. If you can find a place and keep 3/4 of that monthly housing stipend, then that will, you'll make a lot more over time.
And of course, it's going to vary depending on the location you go. Most locations, when they have a higher cost of living, you'll actually get a higher stipend to go along with that. So your stipends are going to be based on the what's allowed by the area. So if you're taking a job in San Francisco Bay Area, the stipend is going to be higher and the housing costs are going to be higher. So it just depends on where you go as to how cheap you're going to be able to find housing. But there are certain travelers who will stay like in a room in a house, like instead of renting an entire place. And they'll actually be able to stay really, really cheap. Like maybe they'll rent a room at somebody's house for only $300 or $400 a month, and then they're just keeping so much of that money. And for some of you guys, that might not work. That might not fit your situation. You really want your own apartment. Maybe you're traveling with family, you have your spouse with you, you have a dog. Maybe you need your own place. So it's up to you what you choose to do about the housing, but we always encourage you try to go as cheap as you can get by with and then keep as much money as possible. So there's some different options for finding short-term housing. Some people will choose just to travel to locations where they already have family or friends and try to stay with them and rent from them there, but that's pretty hard to do. It's not super easy just to always designate exactly where you want to go. So sometimes when you find out where you are going to be going, you will then kind of crowdsource and ask your friends or family, does anybody know anybody in this area? Ask your friends on Facebook, does anybody know of any housing opportunities? There's also groups on Facebook that you can search. There's like a travel therapy gypsy housing, travel nursing gypsy housing. Furnished Finder has a Facebook group. So there's different groups you can search on Facebook to try to find housing. There's also some websites that a lot of travelers use to try to find housing short term. So we all know Airbnb. Some people will search on there. VRBO, Craigslist. Furnished Finder is a really good one. Furnished Finder is actually sort of more designated towards traveling healthcare professionals. So a lot of times they kind of understand your situation on Furnished Finder a little bit better. And you could also search on Facebook Marketplace.
Yeah, and if you don't find any good options on those places, some other options that we've pursued in the past include reaching out to realtors in the area or calling apartment complexes nearby. So you can just kind of Google either realtors or apartment complexes, call them, see if they know of anything or if they have some places that they could offer you short term. You can also contact the facility, and usually this is the HR department. They might know, maybe they've had travelers in the past and they know where the traveler stayed, or they have some connections in the area that they could help you find something that's affordable. Another option is RV parks or campgrounds. Sometimes they have what are called park model campers that they just have parked on the like a campsite there, and they will rent out short term to people. And we've done this in the past when our camper actually was having work done on it. We stayed in one for a few weeks, and it was actually pretty nice. It was it's like a smaller trailer basically, but it's kind of on a permanent foundation. And then another option that we chose for the first few years traveling is to actually stay in a camper or an RV, buy a camper and take it each place with you. That significantly makes housing easier. Housing is much easier that way because then you can just Google RV parks in the area, call the number, and we usually have our housing set up, or back then we used to have our housing set up in probably an hour or less when we were looking at a job. It's really simple. So campgrounds, RV parks to park a camper. Also, sometimes people will advertise RV sites on their property. And our most recent contract, that's what we did. We actually stayed on a lady's property that had RV connections there. We were the only camper there, and she just charged us $200 a month. So it was really cheap and affordable.
Yeah, and if you guys want to know more about specifically the RV tiny living route, we've done separate videos talking about our experience with RVing in the past. We lived in our fifth wheel camper for about 3 years. So that's a different option. I would say the majority of travel therapists go with finding short-term housing. They go with finding either an apartment for rent or somebody renting out a room or part of their house. But there are certain therapists and travel nurses that choose to do the RV route. And it's just a lifestyle choice, so it's really different. But the majority will find short-term housing. So there's some considerations that we want you guys to think about when you are looking at these different places to rent. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, some therapists, some travelers are comfortable with renting a room in somebody's house. And this is sometimes what you'll see when you search on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist. People will advertise like a roommate type situation, or they might rent out, like one time we stayed in, let's see, we've done 2 different short-term housing options outside of our camper. One, the lady had a big property, a farm, and she had an over the garage apartment. So we basically had our own apartment there. But we had to go into the main part of the house to use the laundry and the kitchen. So it was like part shared, part on its own. There's a lot of situations like that, kind of like a mother-in-law suite, where you might have like mostly your own space, but not your whole own space. Or one time we rented an entire furnished basement from a family. So again, we pretty much had our own space, but it was within somebody's house. So you just have to kind of take into consideration what's available. Some places you go, there won't be a lot available. You just kind of have to go with what you can find. And then you have to go with what you're comfortable with. You know, if you're traveling with a significant other, or you just really prefer to have your own space, maybe a room in a house situation is not for you. But just try to think about the cost and try to save as much money as possible, because, you know, you are having to pay expenses back home too. You're having to pay basically double rent if you maintain a tax home and pay expenses there, and rent at your housing location for your travel assignment. So try to keep your expenses as low as possible. The next recommendation is try to find furnished places if possible, and try to find utilities included. We have always done this. We had some good experiences from finding housing on Craigslist that was already furnished and already had utilities included. Sometimes you won't be able to find this. Like if you go through an apartment complex or a realtor, it might just be an empty apartment that has nothing in it. If that's the case, you have some options. You could look at renting furniture when you get there, places like Aaron's that does rentals, or you could buy some cheap furniture, or some people will bring a minimal amount of furniture with them, like a blow-up mattress or that sort of thing. but we encourage you to be as minimalistic as possible. It's kind of a hassle to set up furnishings and utilities for just 3 months. So do with the minimum that you can. Try to get by with a small amount of stuff. A mattress on the floor. You don't need a bed frame. That kind of thing. And then when it comes to utilities, obviously you got to have your electricity and your water, but maybe skip cable. It's kind of a hassle to call a cable company and set up cable for just 3 months.
Yep. And now when considering travel therapy housing, it's very important to be aware of scams. We've heard over the years numerous people having different types of scams happen to them, and this is more common on sites like Craigslist, where people are basically anonymous and they can list anything. Sometimes this has been in the form of someone trying to rent a place that they don't actually own, or someone trying to get a security deposit up front and never actually intending to rent the place at all and basically just keeping your money. Remember that usually you're taking these places sight unseen because you might be taking an assignment 2,000 miles away. You can't go look at it. So you have to kind of trust your gut there. And if it sounds sketchy, don't send money up front. And we know some travelers that to avoid that kind of situation, they will go to their assignment location and stay for maybe 2 or 3 nights in a hotel while they scout out somewhere to stay longer term. So that way you can actually meet with the person and it's not just all by email or by phone. So that is very important. Watch out for scams. Also, it's important to try to get month-to-month leases if possible. And the main reason here for that is if you sign a 3 or 6 month lease, say that your contract is 6 months long and you're like, oh, well, I'm going to be here 6 months, I'll sign this lease. If your contract gets ended early, you might be on the hook for all of that money. And that is a huge way that a lot of travelers lose money. So for example, say you start the contract, you're a month in, and they give you 30 days notice, and you have to be out of there, you're done with your contract 2 months in, and you signed a 6 month lease. You might have to pay $1,000, $2,000 or more to get out of that lease now. Or you might be stuck on the hook for the entire 6 months, and you might not be there at all during that time. So that is a bad situation, and you want to try to avoid that if at all possible. So sometimes places will be advertised as a 3 month lease or a 6 month lease. Sometimes you can negotiate and have them just do month to month. It just depends on the situation. Always shop around and try to negotiate a lower cost or more benefits of some sort. Kind of like with finding jobs. So basically, depending on the area, there's usually several options to choose from. And you just want to find the thing that fits you best that's the lowest cost. And when you find that, try to negotiate with the person. Sometimes if you're staying 3 months, then somewhere like Airbnb, they'll give you a discount. Sometimes you'll be able to, like I said, you can negotiate for month to month instead of paying all 3 months or all 6 months. Negotiate for those kind of things. Another important thing is to take pictures before and after, because we have heard in the past of some situations where a traveler might leave and then the landlord says, oh, you damaged all this stuff. In reality, that was already there beforehand. So always have some pictures before, just so that you have proof of what the place was that you moved into, so that can't happen. And then one more thing is renter's insurance is never a bad thing to have. It's pretty cheap, and if anything crazy happens, it can save you a lot of money.
Yeah, we've never really had any really bad experiences in terms of the landlord. I mean, maybe not our most ideal roommate situation in the world, but nothing crazy. But we have heard some bad stories where some people have gotten screwed over. So just be mindful, protect yourself. And a little bit more about the negotiation. Sometimes people will be willing to negotiate with you if they find out that you're a traveling healthcare professional. So sometimes it might say, okay, we only do year-long leases, or this is the price. But sometimes if you talk to them and you explain your situation, sometimes they'll be willing to negotiate with you different than what it says. So I really think that we should advocate for ourselves and just explain your situation. And sometimes people will be more willing to help you out because they're like, wow, you're a healthcare professional. You're in here to help our community at the hospital, at the clinic. So sometimes they're willing to help you out there. So overall, as kind of a summary of our housing topic today, as we discussed, the company can provide housing for you if you'd like for them to. Sometimes that's the travel company, or sometimes the facility has options for housing for you. But the majority of the time, the travel therapy company is just going to pay you a housing stipend, and you're going to find your housing on your own. And as we said, this is generally what we recommend because most of the time you can take that money and find cheaper housing and then keep what's left over as just additional pay, which is awesome. We recommend, as always, we're really about being financially savvy. If you've listened to any of our videos in the past. So we always recommend try to get as cheap as possible, as long as it suits your needs, as long as it's not sketchy. Get as cheap as possible. You're going to have to take into account your rent back home or your mortgage back home, plus your rent at your travel assignment. So always try to keep expenses in mind. Try to keep as much money at the end of the day in your pocket without spending it all, so that you can save for your long-term financial goals. And overall, as you can see with all this, there's a lot that goes into housing. Like, it can be really a hassle. It's one of the things that deters people from traveling. It's kind of a hassle to set up housing every 3 months or so. But if you use some of the tips and tricks that we went over today, hopefully you'll have a better experience.
Yep. On Saturday, we're going to be posting an article with a lot of the same information, and it might help to see it written down, some of the key points and the tips there. So keep an eye out for that Saturday. And then next week, we're going to be talking about travel therapy licensing on Wednesday as the next part of our 101 series.
So don't forget to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or listening on our podcast. Each week we'll put out the video on YouTube and the audio version on our podcast. So if you don't want to miss a thing, make sure you get the full series and all of our future content. Make sure to click subscribe on YouTube or the podcast. Also, if you're watching on Facebook, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a thumbs up on the video, leave us a comment if you have questions about housing or comments and feedback about what we talked about today.
Yep. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.